Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, Dark Succubus. The man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Dark Succubus in paperback or pre-order on Kindle Unlimited today. I have to wonder if we are in the last days of DC Comics. And the reason why I'm pondering if these are the last days of DC Comics is due to a series of articles I've read regarding the future of DC Comics. And when I take a critical examination of that future is looking bleaker every day. Now, one of these articles from Bounding in the Comics states that DC Comics might not have a future as part of Warner Media under AT&T. Now, a couple of years ago, Warner Brothers was sold to AT&T, and all of its assets were transferred under AT&T's ownership. And when a new company gets a hold of an older company and its assets, it begins doing an audit of those assets to see if they are going to be a value to the new company. And I guess over at AT&T, they're looking at DC Comics and not seeing a real reason to keep this asset on their catalog and as part of their list of overall corporate assets as related to intellectual property. Now, DC Comics was considered a major asset as related to intellectual property for years because many companies could go out of their way to license the characters for things like merchandise such as t-shirts, pencils, action figures, video games. They could license the merchandise as related to them. However, the value of the catalog, as I see it, has declined over the last years due to the failure of the DC cinematic universe, with movies like Man of Steel underperforming, Batman v Superman underperforming, Justice League completely failing, Wonder Woman being the only hit, and then you had Shazam being another underperforming movie. So AT&T is really looking at these DC as an intellectual property house and not seeing the value that the DC property had under Warner Brothers. So they're looking at it and saying, what does it benefit us to keep these characters under in our business? Because it looks like the audience is not really interested in these characters, and it's looking like there's not much demand for these characters. And because there's not much demand for these characters, there's no real way for us to profit from making content that features these characters or licensing these characters to be made into things like films, TV shows, or even go out here and make other merchandise. So they're looking at it from a business perspective and not seeing how DC Comics would have a part of their overall business model, because AT&T's ultimate goal with buying Warner Brothers was to get the content for its streaming service, and what they wanted to do was launch a strong streaming service with lots of solid content. They really did not want to get into the publishing business, and when they look at that publishing business, they see a business that is in dire straits, because these days, when it comes down to DC Comics under Dan Dido's leadership, DC Comics just aren't selling like they used to. And they have been on a continuous state of decline over the last 15 years under Dan Dido's leadership. And this is something that Warner Brothers corporate executives and your AT&T corporate executives are really now taking a critical look at. Your DC Comics being in decline over 15 years, because when they look at the sales, which started out in the early 2000s in the six figures for supposedly A-list characters like Superman and Batman, seeing them going at 200 to 300,000 copies sold, and now they're looking at today at many of these comics, especially books like Batman and Superman, barely able to pull 80 to 40,000 copies sold to comic book stores. They're not seeing much economic value for them as an asset long term. So when they look at your DC Comics, especially the publishing division, they're not seeing any sort of profit to keeping a publishing division afloat. when it continues to hemorrhage losses and it continues to not make any sort of money. Now, your DC Comics, again, has been struggling over the last 15 years, ever since Dan Dido came in charge. And while Warner Brothers was able to sit there and take these losses because they weren't getting some sort of value as related to the intellectual property by selling licenses for merchandise, and were making these movies and TV shows which were allowing them to get ad revenue, AT&T's focus is not on those revenue streams, and its focus primarily is on having sufficient content for its streaming services. So when they look at DC Comics, they don't see the value there. And when they look at what the decisions that your Dan Dido has made over at DC Comics, like ending the classic DC universe in 2011 and implementing the New 52, they're not really seeing a catalog of characters they can really work with, because the DC universe at this point is so jumbled, it's almost impossible to follow many of the modern stories due to the retcons, due to the reboots, and due to the constant flux of the continuity. So they're looking at it and saying, there's not much economic value here because we can't really figure out what these characters are, what they do, or what type of stories you really want to focus on, because there is no real direction over at Warner Brothers. So AT&T is saying to itself, we want to get this publishing division to be something of value, but we don't really see any value. And this is why you had the folding of Vertigo, which was, again, a quality asset in the days of Warner Brothers in its prime, and Mad Magazine. These magazines were not selling, so they're trying to streamline DC. Unfortunately, DC is in a mess, and the main reason why DC is in a mess is because it's still under the ineffective and incompetent leadership of Dan Dido, and your Dan Dido has turned DC from an asset in Warner Brothers catalog to what your AT&T now possibly considers to be a liability. And the reason why they consider it to be a liability is because they're looking at this large catalog of characters, they're looking at this large comic book universe, and they're not seeing anything that they can use for any sort of economic value. They're not seeing how you can turn this publishing division around, because this publishing division just isn't selling enough units. Now, if they would end Mad Magazine, which is sold in retail outlets, the future for DC Comics is looking very dark as I see it. And the reason why it's looking dark is because Mad Magazine had far more distribution than DC Comics, and if your Mad Magazine got cut for poor sales, then DC Comics could possibly get cut for poor sales as well. And the reason why it could get cut for poor sales is because no publisher can stay in business unless they have books that sell. And over at DC Comics right now, they don't have that one book that can keep the entire company afloat. They don't have any books like a Batman, which can sell the big numbers, that can cover the losses for the rest of the catalog. Because under Tom King's beta male writing style, where he's given us this soft, neutered Batman instead of a hard Dark Knight, we have a Batman that literally is almost unreadable, because we don't see the Dark Knight going into high, fast-paced action-adventure stories or trying to solve mysteries. We have a meandering storyline that after the 50th issue has alienated readers, and now that we're at the 76th issue, we have more and more readers wanting to walk away from the Batman title, which was considered to be one of the crown jewels of the DC catalog and one of the best-selling books in the DC catalog. And it sold so strongly that it was able to keep the entire publishing imprint afloat for years. And then we had Superman, which was starting to get some momentum. It was all knocked out because of Brian Michael Bendis coming on with a run that really has not taken off. And again, all of these things short-term have done damage to the overall long-term perspective as related to DC Comics. However, the real problem at DC Comics, as I see it, that has led to the devaluation of DC Comics is Dan Dido, still remaining in the publishing leadership position, along with Jim Lee, two individuals who just don't have the publishing experience to understand how to run a publishing house, two individuals who do not know how to lead a publishing house, or two individuals who do not understand how to direct a publishing house. Yes, Jim Lee is a pretty nice artist, but he just does not have the skills to manage a publishing house, and Dan Dido has no experience whatsoever in publishing, and it shows with his numerous decisions to put all of this darkness and bleakness into DC Comics, which was originally a place where heroes were paragons of virtues and symbols of hope. So when people didn't see the hope in DC Comics towards the end of Rebirth, after Geoff Johns was promoted to another position and saw the return of the bleakness, we started to see the handwriting on the wall as related to DC Comics, because Dido decided to go back to the dark, dreary, depressing story model of the New 52, which led to DC's sales continuing to drop because most people did not see the payoff, which what they were expecting was, with Rebirth, a return to the classic DC universe eventually at the end of Doomsday Clock. Unfortunately, the Doomsday Clock has been delayed so many times that DC is now starting to see a real Doomsday Clock as related to the DC brand. Because at this point, when you have the corporate owners looking at the whole DC brand and saying to itself, you know, this is not as valuable as we thought it was and we just need to sell this off, that's not a good sign for DC Comics, nor is it a good sign for your comic book industry. And the reason why it's not a good sign for your comic book industry is because your comic book industry has been in a struggle for over 30 years, and over the last 5 years has been in a state of free fall. And this whole sale of DC Comics could be the thing that drives the entire industry to collapse, because the big two were the only thing really keeping a lot of the comic book stores afloat. It was most reader demand for those classic titles. However, that demand has been waning due to bad editorial decisions by Dan Dido and other bad editorial decisions by Sana Amanat over at Marvel Comics. And between the two of them, these two leaders who are running these two companies may eventually collapse the comic book industry, because the number of comic shops are closing right now is continuing to grow. The number of readers who used to have interest in DC Comics are declining in new content. And the only thing that is a symbol of hope for the overall comic book industry is the classic or so-called facsimile comics. And we have your Dan Dido now talking about how these nostalgia comics are really hurting the comic book industry because it's supposedly, allegedly driving a so-called speculator market. And I'm looking at Dan Dido, and he doesn't understand the business of publishing. And when it comes down to publishing, again, 90% of all books fail. And you need that 10% of books that are selling in order to cover the losses of the 90. So these facsimile comics that reprint old editions, these are the things that are keeping the company afloat and allowing you to pull profit while you can sit there and be able to absorb the losses on the books that are failing. And the reason why most of the books are failing is due to Dan Dido's continuing pushing this dark, dreary, depressing deconstructionist story model from 30-year-old books like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, even though the marketplace clearly has shown that it has no interest in it, the audience has shown it has no interest in it, and customers just don't want to buy books that feature the same dark, dreary, depressing story model. And instead of Dan Dido adapting and saying, look, this isn't selling, let's try a different approach, let's try to do a different story model, he continues to double down, insisting that his version of DC Comics is the thing that will sell, even though it has been proven that his version of DC Comics just doesn't sell. And his version of DC Comics has not only destroyed the DC Comics publishing division, it also destroyed the DC Comics film division, and it destroyed DC Comics merchandising, because this is one of the reasons why Mattel was not able to sell DC action figures and was in a complete mess after 2011 when the DC Universe Classics line came to an end. And all of this has led to the devaluation of the DC Comics brand overall. But your Dan Dido continues to get upset about old classic DC Comics selling, showing us that the definition of insanity over at DC Comics is Dan Dido and his continuing attempt to do the exact same things and expect a different result. Because he's clearly seen that ever since the New 52 and his Dark model was launched in 2011, that sales have gone from down to free fall, and that even an attempt right now to bring this whole new model back has led to a further decline in sales. So he's been trying to do the exact same things and expects a different result. And now he wants to make excuses saying that it has to do with us not making great stories or us not trying to push the envelope, when people did not come to DC Comics to get the envelope pushed. People come to DC Comics because they want good, old-fashioned, family-centered entertainment. They want PG-13 superhero action and adventure, and they want comic books that all ages can read. That's what people come to DC Comics for, and this is the reason why those facsimile comics from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s continue to outsell books from today, because people don't want the envelope pushed. They just want a good, old-fashioned action and adventure story where superheroes take on supervillains, superheroes overcome the obstacles, and superheroes beat the bad guys, and at the end of the story, the reader gets some sort of hope from this escape from the world, and they can have that hope when they go back out into the real world after reading these fun and fantastic adventures. That's what readers want from DC Comics. They don't want a continued push towards this dark, gritty deconstruction and story model. What they want are just plain old, good old-fashioned, all ages action and adventure, and that's something people aren't getting from DC Comics. And when the customer can't get what they want from a company, what they do is they stop buying the product. And people have stopped buying DC Comics over the last 2 years because they see that they're not getting the payoff with Rebirth that they thought, which was a return to the classic DC universe. And now that they see that Dan Dido wants to push us back to the New 52, they want to walk away from DC overall. But your Dan Dido is sitting there blaming old facsimile comics for the state of DC Comics. He's talking about how their speculators and variant covers are doing damage, when the problem is he's not making the content that customers want. And if you don't make the content that customers want, then guess what? The customers don't buy your product. And the reason why they don't buy your product is because your product just isn't what they asked for. And when it came down to DC Comics, people ever since Identity Crisis have been telling Dan Dido they don't want this kind of content. They don't want these kind of stories. They don't want this type of gore and mutilation of characters. They don't want to see their favorite characters killed in almost every issue. This dark, dreary, depressing story model does not give readers incentive to buy your new comics, because it seems like the more you push the envelope, the more you push the readers away. And the reason why the readers are pushed away is because they don't want to see their friends mutilated. They don't want to see their friends murdered, because these superheroes aren't just characters to these readers. These are their friends. And when they see their friends getting their heads blown, getting a shot in the head like Blue Beetle was in Infinite Crisis, or seeing many of their favorite characters getting mutilated, that doesn't really give me a reason to go buy these comics. I mean, Dan Dido clearly didn't understand the impact of Transformers the movie on a generation of Transformers fans who after seeing their favorite characters that they grew up with, this latchkey generation, seeing their favorite characters murdered, they didn't have an incentive to go buy Cup, RC, Hot Rod, and Springers and Rodimus Primes from Toys R Us because they just got through seeing many of their favorite characters murdered in Transformers the movie. And that's what Dan Dido is doing to DC Comics. He's murdered all of our favorite characters, murdered all of our favorite pop culture icons, and then he wants to talk about how pushing the envelope is going to be good for business. But we clearly see now that AT&T is really pondering getting rid of DC Comics that Dan Dido's approach has literally destroyed an iconic brand. And what's sad is AT&T now is so frustrated that they're looking at it and saying, this may not be a good business deal for us. Now, when I look at DC Comics from a critical perspective, I do see an opportunity to fix DC Comics, but the whole thing of starting to fix DC Comics starts with the firing of Dan Dido, a man who stayed almost 14 years too long at DC Comics, and in almost 14 to 15 years has taken DC Comics from being the crown jewel of Warner Brothers' business division and turned it into a lump of coal that has next to no value. And what he has done to this publishing division is so egregious that sadly no one wants to hold him accountable over in these companies. And now that you have AT&T looking at him, he's looking to deflect and make excuses. And that's something that I look at and see as really sad, because your Dan Dido was the one who was gung-ho with making DC edgy, and now that DC is on the edge, and he's on the edge of possibly losing his job, now he wants to sit here and talk about how old comics are the problem, when if he had just made comics just like the old comics, then maybe DC Comics would be in better shape, maybe it would be a much better company, and maybe right now we would be pushing towards taking DC Comics to the next level as an intellectual property, and taking DC Comics to the next level as related to its business, and reaching an entire new generation of readers with DC products, instead of the company possibly being on the brink of being put out of business. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications, which feature all ages entertainment like the ISIS series and the E-Steam series, you can head over to Amazon.com to pick up those books in paperback and Kindle formats. And if you want to try some of my other books like the John Haynes series and the Smith-Storella trilogy, you may try them also on Amazon.com by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, ISIS, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.